Ladies and gentlemen, here we are in segment 2 of this Juneteenth conversation. Listen, if you're watching us on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and hit the notifications button so you get notifications when we are giving out new content. And then if you're watching us on BlackFridayConversations.com, you can hit the notifications button in your browser and it will let you know when we've dropped new content on the website. So I'm excited about this conversation. We just got through talking about the history of white supremacy and endeavoring to bring some context to this white supremacy conversation. And I know there are a lot of people out there, when we start talking about white supremacy and so forth, we have these two polarities in our country, right? We have a conservative polarity and we have a liberal polarity. And the conservatives, they fight the things that the liberals talk about. The liberals fight the things the conservatives talk about, so forth. And the talking points of one particular party or ideology becomes basically something to frown upon from the other side. So when you start talking about white supremacy, we know that no conservative is having a conversation about white supremacy. That no Republican is saying, hey, let's talk about white supremacy. Why? Because they consider that to be a liberal conversation. But ladies and gentlemen, the concept of white supremacy, the idea of white supremacy, isn't a liberal concept. As a matter of fact, if you go back in American history, as we talked about before, the concept of white supremacy was invented by white people. Let me say that again. The concept itself was not invented by people of color. It wasn't invented by brown and black people. The concept, the very concept of white supremacy was invented by white academics, by white scientists, by white philosophers, and white sociologists. You can just go back and just Google history of the term white supremacy. It'll give you the entire timeline of white supremacy. And guess what? It is white Europeans who coined the conversation and who started this idea that there is a racial hierarchy and a ranking of people based upon their skin color. And white was number 1, yellow was number 2, brown was number 3, black was number 4, and red was number 5. Just Google the term scientific racism. Just Google it. And guess what you're going to find out? This concept of racism and judging people by the color of their skin, which would in turn tell you the content of their character, that was not created by black or brown people. It was created by white Europeans. Yeah, I'm not sure if you knew that or not. So when we start talking about white supremacy, we're talking about what Europeans have been talking about since 1492. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Come on, you remember that from school, right? But guess what we weren't taught? We weren't taught in school that Christopher Columbus not just received permission from the king to chart a new territory, but also from the Catholic Church. There were documents written by the Catholic Church giving Christopher Columbus and various other conquistadors permission to conquer territory in the name of the cross. And listen, not only conquer the territory, but eliminate anybody who stands in your way. Now, mind you, they're going into territory that is the native country of other people. And rather than commingling, quote unquote, no, the goal was to conquer. The goal was to eliminate. The goal was to get rid of. That's another conversation for another day. The point I'm endeavoring to make is the entire framework of white supremacy wasn't something imposed upon white people by brown and black people. No. The very term itself was coined by Europeans who wanted to have global dominance, not just national dominance, but global dominance. That they wanted to control the economic resources and exploit the economic resources of every country that they could. How did Great Britain become Great Britain? Great Britain became Great Britain by what? Exploiting the continent of Africa and taking silver and gold and minerals and precious materials from the continent of Africa and bringing it back and then creating an economy around it and storing gold and silver in the name of the crown. What am I saying to you? I'm saying to you that slavery and Jim Crow were economic issues, not simply moral issues. You see, the moral conversation is this. Eventually, men and women, their heart is going to change. Eventually, inevitably, the world is going to what? Shift morally, and we're going to begin to have a different perspective about black and brown people. And guess what? This whole institution, or the peculiar institution, as it was called, is going to what? End gradually. But see, that argument completely ignores the fact that slavery, that enslavement, that Jim Crow were economic issues more than they were social issues. What's my point? The point is, because there's a perspective about economics, there's now the perspective that whites had in this country. How do we get the most out of this country economically without having to do all the labor necessary in order to have this economic future? You have to have people who do that work for you. Now, when you go back to Europe and you study Europe from the 15th century up to the 17th century or the 18th century, when the Great Revolutionary War took place, if you go back and study European history, what do you find? That in Europe, there's this hierarchy of respectability. And the most respectful Europeans were the ones who didn't work. Let me say that again. The most respectable Europeans were the ones that didn't work. They were able to give their time to arts and to philosophy and to study and to romantics and so forth, but not work. Because the Europeans who worked were considered to be lower class. You remember the concept of serfs from your history class? That whole concept, because why? These were the poor whites in Europe who could not afford to spend their time on philosophy and psychology and romantics and art and benefit from all of the cultural advantages of the European society. Because why? They had to work from sunrise to sunset. And guess what happened? Millions of these Europeans were the former and first founders of the United States of America. You see, we were told in the church, that people were leaving Europe, they were escaping religious persecution. And they're right, except it's just not complete. They were escaping religious persecution and economic persecution, that they were considered to be the lower class in Europe. And guess what? In order for them to have this great opportunity, they were industrial, they were inspired, and they came to this country and they wanted to found this country for economic purposes and economic freedom. But how do they build this country? We need millions of people to do the labor. We need millions of people to do the labor. So what happened? Now we have 1619, right? 1619. Virginia colony being established. What happened? When these entrepreneurs, agricultural entrepreneurs landed here, what did they bring with them? Or more specifically, who did they bring with them? They brought 9 to 10 Black Africans to labor. And next thing you know, we know the Middle Passage and transatlantic slave trade and all of these things happened, and millions of Black people were brought from Africa to work. And then after the international slave trade was ended, then you had the domestic slave trade, where Black people in this country were cultivated, bartered, sold, sexed, unfortunately, to create the army necessary to cultivate tens of millions of southern acres of land. And then we had the westward expansion. You had the Louisiana Purchase in this country. And then you had a lot of issues between the North and the South, because the North was saying have slavery, but it's not expanding. It's not expanding into the new territory. The South was saying, no, we have this way of life and we're going to continue to expand. And then the tension became between North and South. It was over money, ladies and gentlemen. It was over economics. And the economics that drove this war was the economy of slavery. It was big government, quote unquote, telling little government, the South, you're not going to expand slavery. The Southern states were like, No, we're going to do it. The point I'm endeavoring to make to you is this. Don't let anybody convince you that the slavery issue was just moral. No, it wasn't just moral. It was more economic than it was moral. Why is this important today? Because going back to what I said in the last segment about white supremacy, you have what? 3 different broad categories. You have what? Exclusion, you have exploitation, and then you have elimination. And so within the context of American history, once quote unquote exploitation could not be used anymore because 1865s, et cetera, Juneteenth, now let's exclude Black people from the wealth creating opportunities of this country. So now think about this for a second. At the exact same time, Dr. King told us this specifically, at the exact same time that the American government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West to European immigrants, millions of acres of land, at the exact same time, they wouldn't even give Black people 40 acres and a mule. That Black people were released into America without education, without land, without tools to cultivate, etc. So what happened? Black people had to what? Revert back to a form of pseudo-slavery. And that pseudo-slavery was called sharecropping. Now, just study the history of sharecropping. I can't even get into that because I would literally get frustrated. But just the whole concept of sharecropping, that now the land that the Blacks cultivated, that they've been cultivating for hundreds of years, knowing how to produce, knowing how to make it grow, knowing how to grow crops and so forth. Now they have to go back and work for the same slave masters for no money. So the slave masters are able to what? Set up the accounting system. So all the things that you need in order to be successful as a cultivator of land, I'm going to make them available to you at my own price. And guess what? Every year, you never break even. Every year, you never make a profit. As a matter of fact, every year, you're going to be in the red. So guess what that means? You got to work for me another year because you're in the red. And guess what? The next year, you got to keep on working for me because what? You're in the red. And so now we have another almost 100 years of pseudo-slavery, where Black people are not able to participate in the full economic experience of this country. And yes, we know there are pockets of Black success, such as Greenwood and Tulsa, such as certain communities in Detroit, certain communities in Harlem and New York. We know there are pockets of success, but where did those pockets of success come from? It was because Black people were able to have control over that local economy. And guess what? They weren't in the South. What's the point that I'm endeavoring to make? I'm endeavoring to make the point to you that just because a small pocket of Black people experience success through their own ingenuity and through creating a context where they can benefit, that does not change the overall context of what happens with Black people nationally, which is the conversation I have with people all the time right now. People say, Marcus, look at LeBron James, Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, Bob Johnson. Think about rap artists and this and that and entertainers, etc. And I tell them, you're talking about fewer than 1,000 people. There are 44 million Black people in this country, and you're talking about 1,000. There are 1,000 white billionaires in this country. What are we talking about? There is an economy that proliferated in this country that created a wealth gap that McKinsey & Company is one of the most respected consulting companies in the world. And McKinsey has been doing this research for the past 7 to 10 years, and they estimate the wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans to be anywhere between 15 to 25 trillion dollars. Yeah, that's a T. 15 to 25 trillion. Now, let me tell you really quickly. $1 trillion is a stack of $1,000 bills on top of each other. Stack, 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 stack. Going up 67 miles high. That's 1 trillion. And McKinsey estimates the wealth gap to be between 15 to 25 trillion dollars. That for every dollar of wealth that a white person has in this country, a Black person has 8 cents. For every dollar, Black people have 8 cents. You see, this wealth gap conversation isn't something that we can begin to evaluate at 1965. Think about this for a second. Home ownership in this country. Most people don't even know that the government, the federal government, subsidized white Americans to buy homes in various suburbs across this country. We're talking about Detroit, we're talking about Chicago, we're talking about New York, we're talking about LA, we're talking about various metropolitan areas. The federal government subsidized white Americans not to rent homes, not to rent apartments, but to buy homes all across this country in the late 1840s, all the way up through until the mid 1960s. The federal government subsidized. You're talking about homes that could have been purchased easily by African Americans. Middle class African Americans could afford to buy these homes. They were $12,000 to $15,000. Black people could afford those homes, but black people were excluded by the FHA, by builders, and by realtors. Local homeowners, contracts, and covenants excluded homes from being bought by black people or being sold to black people. Does that make sense? So we're talking about black people being excluded from home ownership, and everybody knows in America that home ownership is the foundation of wealth in this country. Not only personal wealth, but generational wealth, because you're able to pass down equity. You're able to use equity to pay for college. You're able to use equity to stave off economic hardship. And black people were excluded from that process, not just thousands, but tens of thousands of homes all over this country. The suburbs, as we know them today, were financed by the government, and it excluded black people from that process. Then when we go up into around 1968, when you have legislation to affect, the FHA and so forth, now black people can buy these homes. But there was no government agency to enforce these laws until 1988. So think about that for a second. 1968 legislation, 1988 is the beginning of enforcement. You're talking about nearly 60 years of advantage, and we're just talking about housing. We're not talking about investments. We're not talking about jobs. We're just talking about housing. And guess what? You can go to a particular neighborhood right now, such as Levittown in the Long Island community in New York. And those properties that were bought for $10,000 and $15,000 back in the early 40s, guess what those properties cost now? $600,000, $700,000, $1 million. Look at the equity. Look at the generational wealth that has been passed. This is just one segment of society. What am I saying to you as we begin to close? I'm saying to you that yes, you should fight for change of policy and legislation. Yes, you should advocate for housing, fair housing. Yes, you should have a strategy to own a home if you don't own a home right now. If you're renting, you need to have a strategy to own a home. Yes, these are things that you need to do, but you need to understand that the wealth creation in this country wasn't created haphazardly or coincidentally. But the wealth gap in this country was created intentionally because the goal of white Europeans from the very beginning of this country was to create economic advantage for themselves at the expense of black, brown, and red people. We did not create this narrative. We're just simply interpreting it the right way. The concept of white supremacy was created by white people for white people, and it was novel and normal up until the mid 20th century. So you and I have the opportunity to challenge these ideas. You and I have the opportunity to create a sacred context for this conversation so that we're not talking about hating anybody, but we are talking about being clear about the history, being clear about the present, and charting a course for a significant future for black people.